Hey guys, it is that time of the year. We are finally starting our coverage of Australian Survivor, Titans versus Rebels with our preseason power ranking. And obviously I'm pretty excited for this season. We got our cast pretty recently, a bit later than last season, but here we are. And now I'm giving my first impressions of these people going into the season, which will obviously be wrong, but that's how the game is. But there are 24 players to look at, and let's waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 24, the person I believe is the least likely to win Australian Survivor coming into it is Kelly. And Kelly is a pretty interesting figure. She's one of the older people in the cast at 52. She's also a psychologist, and she talks about how coming into this game is going to be like a psychologist playground. And rather bad, I feel like that's probably not the right approach to go about it, to treat people like your clients in a therapist setting. And plus, we've seen people like Tori from Survivor 42, people that have a psychology background, don't necessarily do that well on Survivor. And I feel like Kelly is going to have a hard time, given that she is one of the older people in the cast, given that Australian Survivor tends to favor more physical people early on. And I feel like with that background, I feel like she has a lot of potential to be an early boot here. And in general, I feel like she's probably not as big of a fan compared to the other players. So I feel like while there is a chance she could get through some of these early rounds, I feel like she's definitely on the more likely side of being an early boot, which is why she's here at number 24. Now moving on to number 23, and we have another player that I'm just not feeling that great about. And here we have Jessica, who is a professional academic. And I feel like Jessica reminds me a lot of Emily from Survivor 45, where it comes off as this more analytical figure, someone who doesn't care about the journey. We even see in her bio that she talks about not having empathy and that she's got the game all wrapped up. She just has to outlast everyone. And to me, I feel like Jessica feels very similar to Emily, where she's someone who's overconfident. She's someone who will probably not try super hard to connect with a lot of players early on. And I feel like this will get her into trouble pretty early. Now, obviously, we did see on 45 that Emily did end up doing pretty well by the end of it, and she even had a bit of a growth arc during the season. Though at the same time, Emily was almost the first boot on that season. So while it's possible Jessica could have the same upside if she survives, it's just a question of whether she can even get through those first couple of rounds. And personally, I just don't feel like it's super likely. So she's here at number 23. Now moving on to number 22, and we have another player that I just don't feel that great about coming into it. And here we have Mark Warnock, who is a former diplomat. And I feel like in a lot of ways, this guy could come off as schemy right off the bat. I mean, just looking at his cast photo, he's definitely someone who plays the politician role well. And I feel like he'll definitely rub off as a politician to other people, to where people probably won't trust him that much. Now, he does acknowledge in his bio that he knows that it's not going to be a walk in the park for him and that this game will be a challenge. But I feel like this guy still could very well come off as kind of sketchy, someone who definitely fits that role as a diplomat, to where he could very well be an early boot. He reminds me in a lot of ways of Michael from Heroes vs. Villains, and while I could see Mark endearing himself a bit more compared to Michael, I still worry a lot that he'll have that trajectory of being this relatively early boot, which is why I have him here number 22. Now moving on to number 21, and we have someone who is also pretty high variance and someone that I don't have a ton of faith in, and here we have Garrick, who is on the Rebels tribe despite being a loss prevention officer, which I do find pretty funny, and he's also the oldest person on the cast at 59, and that could definitely be a liability to him early on, where people just write him off as being the old guy, someone who's not very good at challenges. And with Australian Survivor being a more physical game compared to Survivor US, I feel like that'll definitely be a bigger hindrance to Garrick's game in that regard. Though at the same time, we also hear him talking about like thinking young and wanting to have fun, and that he'll definitely try to endear himself to some of the younger people here. Now, whether that'll be effective, we'll have to see. I feel like he is a very high variance player, someone who will either be a very early boot or someone who will get towards the end of the game. Though at the same time, I feel like even if he does make a deep run, I do worry a lot that he could fall into the Jerry mold from Heroes vs. Villains, on someone who's just kind of dragged to the end and kind of struggles to garner respect that way. So there's definitely a lot of downside with Garrick coming into the season. But the reason I have him above the other people is I feel like he's a bit more likely to get that better case scenario of getting towards the end of the game. I feel like I could see more of a path for him sliding through those early rounds and in turn like being part of a majority alliance, even if he doesn't have much influence within it. So that's why I have him above those other people, though realistically 21 is about as high as I can put him. Now moving on to number 20, and we have someone who is a little less likely to be an early boot. though at the same time, I do find it hard to see how this person gets towards the end. And here we have Tobias. And I feel like Tobias is a bit of a weird case here, where he's definitely one of the more physical people here. He's obviously on the Rebels tribe, and he does scream out to me as someone who wants to be a leader for their tribe coming into it. And through that, I could see him getting through these early rounds a bit more than the people we already talked about. But at the same time, I feel like this is someone who will eventually be targeted for being the leader of their alliance. And there's even a chance that he could overplay coming into it. I feel like this is more so a vibe-based pick than anything else. But I feel like this is someone who I don't see as super likely to win, which is why I have him here at number 20. Now moving on to number 19, and we are going back to someone a bit more high variance, and here we have Caroline. And Caroline's another one of the older people here at 55, and she has a pretty interesting job with her being a midwife here, and she is someone who talks a lot about like her advantages and disadvantages, like her having a lot of life experience and her like being under duress in a lot of situations. Again, I feel like she's someone who, similar to Garrick, will definitely struggle out there initially because of her age. I feel like she doesn't scream out to me as a super physical specimen, so I feel like that could be a disadvantage. Though at the same time, I can definitely see her endearing herself to her tribe socially. It's just a question of whether they'll be able to put up with her physical ability, whatever that may be. But again, I feel like she's definitely one of the more high variance people, and I'm also not entirely sure like how big of a fan she is coming into it, so I feel like that's a bit of a question mark. But again, if she is able to get through a lot of the game, I feel like she could do well. Though compared to the other people, I also worry she could be an early boot, which is why she is here at number 19. Now moving on to number 18, we have another pretty high variance player in my eyes, and here we have Charles, who is a lawyer coming into it. And this guy definitely reminds me a lot of Stephen Fishback just looking at him, though at the same time that could also be a negative in the sense that he could come off as a bit sketchy, like people may not be able to trust him early on. And while I could see him hiding his intelligence, I also feel like that could also like further distrust with people to where people will want him out early on. So I do worry a bit about Charles in that regard, though he is someone who seems pretty intelligent, someone who is able to know the game, and I feel like if he is able to get through those early rounds, I feel like that could definitely benefit him to that regard. But still, it's that question of whether people can actually trust him that leaves him a bit lower on this list for me, so he's here at number 18. Now moving on to number 17, and we have someone who I think will make it a bit further in the game, though I still don't feel that confident in them, and here we have Jaden. Now, Jaden's a bit of an interesting case as well, as he's obviously a pretty big physical guy, and he is someone who does talk a lot about working out at the gym and that he likes to get aggressive at the gym, only to be like laughing and smiling outside. He calls himself a gentle giant, but then he goes on to talk about having been to Fiji before and that Samoa's similar enough to Fiji and that he wants to prove himself and that being there makes him proud. And I'm not entirely sure what to make of Jaden, if I'm being honest. I don't really know how much game knowledge he has coming into it. And I feel like with him being this inherently big guy, he is someone who probably will be an asset to his tribe early on, but then later become a pretty massive target down the stretch. And with me not knowing how big of a fan he is, I'm not really sure how he's going to react to that per se. So I do worry a lot in that regard for Jaden. But again, he is someone who I think will make it a little bit in the game, which is more than I can say about the other people, so I have him here at number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we have someone pretty similar to Jaden in a lot of ways, and here we have Wina, who I believe is a TikToker and an influencer, so kind of a celebrity, but I feel like Wina gives me very similar vibes to Jaden, where he does talk a lot about his life experience and that life is sales no matter what it is. So I do find that kind of interesting. And I feel like Wina is someone who probably will not be an early boot. I feel like he is someone who seems likable enough to scrape his way through a lot of the pre-merge. And I feel like he is someone who's a bit less likely to be targeted in the post-merge compared to Jaden, which is a big reason why I have him above Jaden. But it's largely that question mark of how much he knows coming into it that definitely holds me back from having him higher. So for that reason, Wina is not my Wina pick. He's here at number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we are going back to someone a bit more high variance, and here we have Scott. And I feel like if this were Survivor US, I probably would have Scott a little bit higher, though considering how physical of a game Australian Survivor is, I am a bit more worried about Scott, where he does admit himself that he is not the most physical specimen. He talks about having chicken arms and painter's limbs, and that people will judge him right off the bat for being a liability. Though at the same time, like he wants people to underestimate him and that he'll skate through the game that way. So I do feel like that's definitely something in his favor. though it's a question of whether people will be too quick to label him as that weakness and take him out because of it. That makes me a bit worried about his prospects coming into it. Though again, if he is able to scrape on by, I do have some confidence in him to eventually get towards the end of the game. But again, it's that big question mark that leaves him here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we probably have the person I got the least amount from their bio, and here we have Sarah. And I find her bio here to be pretty underwhelming. Like, she talks a lot about the universe and how like there's like some signs pointing towards her career and stuff, and that we're all connected by destiny or something. Again, not really anything to do with the actual game. So I did find that kind of hard to parse out. And there aren't like that many red flags right at the bat. I mean, she seems to be in fine enough shape. She is a firefighter after all. And there could be this spiritual element to her personality, kind of like Kendra from 45. So again, there are like some good signs here. But at the end of the day, I just don't really know much about her. I could see her like having a Kendra like run where she's just kind of picked off in the middle of the game. I could also see her being a Rach from Survivor UK, where despite her seeming like this physical like asset to our tribe, she's still taken out relatively early due to people not really trusting her that much. So again, it's kind of hard to make sense of Sarah's prospects here, which is why I have her here number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we have someone not dissimilar from Sarah, but here we have Rianna. And Rianna seems like another seemingly good pick here. I mean, she is a paramedic. She is someone who has gone on like outdoor adventures before. Like, she is someone who is probably going to acclimate to the elements well. And I feel like those are things that make her a fine pick. I just feel like there's nothing that really elevates her to the next level in my eyes. And I feel like there are just other people that I feel like have more upside to compare to Rianna, where I feel like she'll probably make the merge, I assume. Though beyond that, like, I'm not entirely sure what to make of her overall prospects, which is why she's here number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have someone who I can easily see going either way, and here we have Ferris, who does seem to be a pretty big character, someone who definitely was meant to fill the George role for this season. And I do feel that could be a hindrance to him, where we literally just saw George play 2 pretty strong seasons in the last couple of years. And I do worry that Ferris could have that target on his back coming into it, to where he probably could be an early boot. But at the same time, he comes off as someone who knows the game pretty well. And I feel like if he is able to get the runway that George got, that he could make a very similar run to George. So I feel like he definitely has a lot of the upside to play a pretty strong George-like game, but I also feel like he has a lot of the downside with George, of potentially being an early boot, and people just feeling like he could be a big threat because of that. So I do hesitate with putting him higher in the list because of that, though at the same time, I feel like he has plenty of upside to where he is here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have someone kind of similar to Ferris, maybe not as high variance, but also someone I do worry about a little bit in the game, and here we have Eden, who is a cinema area manager, which is a pretty interesting job. And judging by his cast photo and his intro package, he does seem like he'll be a pretty interesting character on this show. Now, I do have a little bit of concern about how he'll come off to people early on. There definitely could be a scenario where he's on the outs, but at the same time, he has a lot of the upside that Ferris has, where he's a pretty big fan of the show. I feel like he's someone who will probably know how to play the game if he's given the runway. And he also talks about having to work with different age groups, different demographics, different opinions. So I feel like he definitely has at least some ability to get this runway to begin with. So I feel like that gives him an edge over Ferris in my eyes. And it wouldn't shock me if Eden plays a pretty impressive game. Though at the same time, I could also worry about his prospects at the very end if he were to get towards the end, where he could possibly be like a Carolyn, for instance. So I feel like those things hold me back from putting him higher, though I feel like there's enough upside there to have him here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have another pretty interesting prospect, and here we have Raymond. And I feel like Raymond could be an interesting character here, where he's talked about like being worried about how others perceive him. He talks about how he's going to meet some of the most interesting people in the Rebels tribe. And again, I feel like the run could go either way for him. Now, he does work in retail, so you would assume that he's pretty good socially. And again, I feel like he could definitely go either way here, where on one hand, he is someone who probably will be able to build good social bonds and be able to have some longevity because of that. Though at the same time, I also do worry about how he'll do if he gets towards the end, where coming out the bat, he doesn't seem like someone a jury would respect. So I feel like he would need to play a really aggressive game if he really wants to actually win by the end of it. But again, I feel like the upside is there. I feel like he definitely has a shot of doing well in the season, which is why he's here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and kind of similar to Raymond, I could see this person going either way, though I am willing to give them the benefit of the doubt, and here we have Kitty. Now Kitty's another pretty interesting player here, where even though she is a bit on the older side, she is really good physically, being a gym owner, and she also talks about wanting to empower women, and again, a lot of this seems pretty good right off the bat. Now beyond that, I'm not entirely sure how big of a fan she is coming into the season, so I think that'll be pretty interesting to see. But I feel like Kitty at least has some potential coming into it, potentially be a leader of her alliance early on. And again, I feel like all that's pretty good, but I feel like the people we'll be talking about soon have more upside in my eyes, which is why she's here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have someone pretty similar to Kitty, and we actually have Kirby, who I believe is our first celebrity player on here, being a former AFLW coach. And again, she is a pretty interesting prospect as well. Now, I do question how good she is physically, where on one hand, she's obviously a pro athlete, but she also talks about having gone through knee reconstructions and concussions. So again, whether she's all there or not, we'll have to see. But she does also talk about like wanting to be a leader for her tribe, not dissimilar to that of Kitty. And I think I do have some faith in her to actually build an alliance around her early on. I feel like she will probably be in a good position to begin with. It's just a question of whether she can hold on to it for the entire game or whether she'll be targeted for being this big threat down the road. I do question that aspect, but I feel like she still has a lot of upside coming into the season, which is why she's here number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have someone who I do like a lot, though how well they'll do we'll have to see, but we actually have Viola, who I believe is the youngest player in the cast at 22. And despite her age, she actually has a lot of life experience where she's originally from South Sudan and she talks about moving around a lot growing up and having to deal with different personalities. I feel like she'll definitely come off as a very likable player on the cast, and she's also very good physically, being a power lifter. I feel like she'll probably do pretty well early on and have a lot of longevity because of that. Though at the same time, I think her age could be a detriment in the sense that while she does have this life experience, whether that will turn into respect by the end of it will remain a question. So I think it's largely her age that keeps me from having her higher in the list. But again, I feel like if she's able to get around that, if she's able to like play like a solid game, I think there's a chance that jury could respect her by the end of it. But again, I feel like I'm more confident in other people, which is why she's here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have a pretty interesting player to get into here, and here we have Valeria. And right away, Valeria reminds me a lot of Liz, the winner of Heroes vs. Villains. And I feel like Valeria is in an interesting spot to play a similar game, where she does talk about like wanting to play at the cliche girl and that she wants to come off as ditzy and that people want to underestimate her. I think she does fit a pretty interesting role within her tribe, and I can very well see her having the Liz upside by the end of it. Though at the same time, I do worry she could be an early boot. I could see a world where that happens, particularly if people are threatened by her or if people just see her as cold early on. But again, I feel like if she's able to get around that, she definitely has a strong chance to navigate through the game pretty well. She seems to be in pretty good shape physically, though we'll have to see how that plays out. But I feel like it's largely that upside that leads her here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and I did debate whether this person was too high. However, I feel like this person on paper seems to be built pretty well for Australian Survivor, and here we have Alex. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I didn't get that much from Alex's bio, where he largely talks about being a teacher and that he's playing for his mom who has breast cancer. And again, on paper, there's not much there, but I feel like archetype wise, he seems to be built pretty well for a game like this. He reminds me a lot of Matt from Heroes vs. Villains, and even Matthew from UK, where again, he does seem like a pretty chill, affable, physical enough guy to where he's probably not going to be targeted much in the pre-merge. And even in the post-merge, I feel like there are going to be plenty of bigger threats compared to him. And I feel like if he's able to get towards the end of the game, I could see him winning some challenges. I could see him like fitting that mold to where he could very well be in a good spot to do well in the game. It's just a question of whether he can actually win if he gets to the end. And it's largely a question of whether he lives up to that archetype. But again, I feel like with him not giving off many red flags right at the bat, I do have him here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have someone who I feel like could do pretty well on the season, but I do have one reservation with them, and here we have Eileen. And Eileen's a pretty interesting player. I mean, she is a waitress, so I assume she'd be pretty good socially. She's also a pretty big fan from what I recall, so I feel like she definitely has the game knowledge there. And I feel like if she's able to get in a good position, I assume she'll be able to do pretty well there. I will say my one hesitation with her is she does talk about how it's going to be a struggle with not being in control a lot of the time, and that she's just going to have to adapt and let the big personalities have a go at it. Which, again, I could give her take. I feel like it could be a pro in the sense that she knows how to adapt to the game well, though I could also see it being a flaw in the sense that she could potentially have this underlying controlling tendency, kind of like as we saw with the bio of Sabrina from Survivor UK. So I feel like that was enough to maybe hesitate a little bit. But again, I feel like Eileen is definitely built well for a game like Australian Survivor, so I have her here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and we have another player that I feel pretty strong about coming into it, and that person is Peta. And again, I feel like there's a lot to like about Peta. She is a bar manager, so again, I would assume she'd be pretty good socially. She's also a pretty big fan of the show from what I recall. And she is someone who isn't that young. I mean, she is 33, so I feel like she's kind of in that prime age to play Survivor. And again, she definitely gives us some interesting responses here, like talking about being a teen mom, and that as being a rebel, that she's going to have some fun out there. Again, there's definitely a lot to like with Peta in my eyes, and I feel like she probably will do pretty well on the show. But I feel like compared to the top 2, I feel like Peta's definitely more of a risky take in my eyes. I feel like there could be a bit more variance with Peta compared to the top 2, at least based on the bios. So I do have her here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and we have the other celebrity on the board, and here we have Nathan. And again, I did decide to go with Nathan here. I do like a lot of the responses he gives in his bio. Like, he talks about like need to be loyal to a degree, but also knowing that you need to keep your options open. Again, I feel like he comes into it with a pretty good understanding of the show. And I will admit that there is a bit of downside in terms of him potentially being targeted in the post-merge. I mean, with him being a professional AFL player, there's a chance he could be targeted because of that. But again, I feel like he gives a lot of pretty good responses in his bio. I feel like he definitely has a good head on his shoulders coming into it. And I feel like there's definitely a chance that he could align with some of these bigger threats down the road and potentially have a run similar to that of Mark from Blood vs. Water. So I feel like there's definitely some upside with Nathan here, and a big reason why I feel confident about him coming into it. But I feel like my number 1 person is probably more of a traditional pick, definitely someone who I feel good about coming into the season. So I do have to leave Nathan here at number 2. And now at number 1, my winner pick going into Australian Survivor Titans versus Rebels is Frankie. And I feel like Frankie has a lot of things going for her. She is a salon owner, very similar to Jam Jam from 44. Again, a very social job, so you would assume that she'd be pretty good socially. She's also someone who is a big fan of the show, and through that, she would have a lot of game knowledge there. And she is someone who definitely gives a good bio, like talking about how Survivor plays like high school and that you can't be too popular. Otherwise, like the popular kids get killed first. Like you talked about, like need to let everyone come forward, letting everyone have a voice. In that she is someone who probably will not be too out in front at the end of the day. And I feel like that definitely gives Frankie like a good mindset coming into the show. I feel like Frankie reminds me a lot of Kelly from 45, who was my winner pick coming into the season. And while that didn't pan out, I mean, I still feel like Kelly played a pretty competent game on that season. And I feel like Frankie is definitely in a better environment to do well with that game style compared to Kelly from 45, where people of that archetype tend to be picked out more often. I feel like with Australian Survivor being a more physical game, a game where physical threats tend to be taken out, I feel like Australian Survivor is a game that definitely favors someone like a Frankie, someone who is pretty well rounded, but not overly threatening to the point where people will have to take her out. So I feel like that gives her a pretty big advantage coming into it. And I feel like while there is that downside of her being taken out post-merge like Kelly, I feel like with Australian Survivor being a more favorable environment, and with Frankie being someone who checks off a lot of the right boxes for me, I do have her here at number 1 as my winner pick. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps out the channel. Now, obviously, once the season starts, you can expect weekly power rankings of Australian Survivor, so you can look forward to that. And along with that, power rankings for the traders as well. That season's been pretty good. And obviously, other reality TV content in the build-up to Survivor 45. I'm on Patreon, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way. But for now, that is the video. See ya.